Good evening and welcome to The Source for our March lecture from the Tipperary People and Places series. This evening we welcome Dr. Coleman Dennehy, whose topic is Crime, Punishment and the Assize Record in Later 17th Century Tipperary. So Coleman, without any further ado, the floor is yours. Okay?
Thank you very much, Mary. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to Thurles. It's a real thrill, and for the first time I've had the opportunity to give an in-person talk in, I think, about 2 years or just over it, so it's a special treat. So a few years ago I was approached by a publisher called Bloomsbury over in the UK to write a book on crime and punishment, and it wasn't an area that I'd always had a huge interest in, but when I had a look around to see what else was written on it, to see who else's books I could kind of copy from to throw my own together, I found there was actually very few other pieces written, and it was always a bit of a mystery to me because things like hanging and jail and transportation and things like that can sometimes be a common theme in Irish history and Irish folklore and Irish kind of memory or received memory that we might get from the past or from generations who went before us. But in the kind of more scientific history, as it might be written or published, say in universities, it's not as prominent, so that made me curious for a start. And then when I started looking around, I found that we didn't actually have a huge amount of source material, and I came across 2 volumes in the National Library of Ireland that had in excess of 1,400 references and hearings, and in some cases indictments for trials held in the Liberty of Tipperary, which covers more or less the modern county of Tipperary today. And because these hadn't been destroyed like most other Irish source material for the time, it makes them very precious. And I've got family from Clonmel, where my father's from originally, so I've always had a sort of an interest and a soft spot. You know, this is obviously not my first visit to Tipperary, and certainly not around midsummer when there's hurling on. So the talk this evening will try to put a little flesh on the bones of Irish county justice in the early modern period. In particular, it will study the much underutilised assize books, and an assize is just hearings, court hearings that are heard twice a year, usually in springtime and autumn, and they'd be equivalent to something like the kind of the high court system that we would have today. There are local courts as well called quarter sessions that are held 4 times a year in the localities, and they'd be more akin to sort of like the district court that we might have today. Now, actually, the title of the paper is a little misleading in that it fails to acknowledge that although the 2 volumes of manuscripts I'll be discussing are titled Clonmel Assize Books, it really relates to assize justice for the entire liberty, or what is sometimes known as the Palatinate of Tipperary. It's 800 years of manuscript evidence for the history of Irish civilization been incinerated in the course of about 3 minutes when shells land in the 4 courts in Dublin in summer 1922. As many of you may know, the general tragedy that are most civil wars was exacerbated all the more for historians in Ireland by the decision of anti-treaty forces in 1922 to occupy the 4 Courts complex, and in particular to use the buildings that house the Public Record Office as an arsenal and a bomb-making facility. So that would be the buildings over here on the left-hand side of the 4 Courts complex as we know it today. Equally tragic was the decision made by Free State forces to shell the building in the summer of 1922. Soon after the bombardment began, shells struck the Treasury building, and within a short few minutes, a huge amount of documentation relating to Ireland's legal history and so many other types of history as well, since the earliest days of the colonies in the later 12th century, was incinerated. Nice thick cut stone walls kept the force of the explosion all centred in on the contents of the building, so whilst a lot of explosions exploded outwards, a lot of this rebounded back in, and so everything inside, almost everything, got absolutely destroyed. You'll still get some old documents that got flung out of windows in the National Library, and they are all singed around the sides. There's all the burn marks. Now, some of the material had been printed or reported on before this calamity, such as the Commons and Lords journals in the 18th century, or indeed various categories of medieval rolls in the 19th century. Much of it, however, was not saved in any manner, and reading the list of the material destroyed compiled by the deputy keeper, a guy called Herbert Wood, makes for truly heartbreaking reads. It is easily the saddest book in Irish history. We are lucky to have some elements of the sources for medieval legal history, however, such as some of the justiciary rolls, the common bench rolls, the memorandum rolls for, say, Edward II's reign. For other reigns, there are transcripts and calendars of varying quality that have been made, which allow us to piece together some of our record. For the early modern period, strangely enough, though, considering that you'd expect the closer we get to the modern age, the higher quality of the source material we would have, that's not the case. We have a very good record of who our judges were of the common and equity courts, along with various legal officers, and we also know a fair bit about when these figures were involved in political matters. However, the exact nature of the process of criminal justice, the nature of the cases and of the litigants or the accused is not as apparent to us. Generally, there will be some record left of special commission courts, such as the Court of Claims in the 1660s or the Court of Castle Chamber, and then sometimes we'll get informal records of, say, King's Bench trials for those worth remembering from the period. For instance, the trial of Oliver Plunkett, which I've been reading recently, but even there it's his trial in London, not his trial in Ireland. So it's an Irish criminal justice trial, but it's not one taking place inside. There are records of more ordinary cases that have survived sometimes as well for the 17th century. That's for Kilkenny City in I think it's about 1670, January 1679. So those are very minor courses, the kind of thing you'd get hauled up before a district court judge today in Ireland. So kind of fairly, relatively more minor things, nothing that could get you into too much trouble. Now these are wonderful to have. For example, in the National Library of Ireland, there's a brief, like I say, a sessions of the peace or the quarter session for Kilkenny, and it appears St. Canice's Irish town. Remember, Kilkenny City is two cities in the Middle Ages in the early modern period. Down the sort of north end of the town is St. Canice's or Irish town by the cathedral, just over the river, the small river, the River Breagoch, I think it's called, and then down around the castle is Kilkenny proper. So they elect, for example, 4 MPs to the Irish Parliament, two separate cities. Now this is only a small amount, it doesn't satisfy curiosity, and as you can see here, the mice have been eating the record before the historians got their hands on it. There are also some records for Longford, but being the records of just autumn 1688 and spring 1690, again it's too short to be able to say a huge amount in terms of spreading our ideas across a larger amount of time or a larger geographical period. Nevertheless, these sort of bits and bobs are very, very useful. This is the front of the Clonmel assize book. If you can't read it quite closely, it says assize apud Clonmel, 20th of April 1683, and then just here it says the Lord Seneschal's book. And these are the documents that I want to talk about tonight. The very fact then that we have 2 volumes of assize records for Tipperary with almost 1,500 separate hearing entries means that we have a very rare glimpse into the nature of assize justice in early modern Ireland. So for the Kilkenny ones, I think I have just about maybe 25 hearings, so something like 1,500, and across the whole county of Tipperary is superb. Now, Palatinate or Palatine jurisdiction or liberty jurisdiction in Ireland, like in England, allowed for a separate entity, sometimes a similar size as a county, but essentially reserving many of the rights and privileges traditionally in the hands of the Crown were instead vested in the hands of a local magnate. They were relatively common in the Middle Ages. In Ireland, for instance, we have a Liberty of Ulster, Liberty of Leinster, Liberty of Meath. As in England, there was Palatine jurisdictions under the Bishop of Durham, or indeed in Lancaster or Chester in the northwest of England. As a general rule, they were established in areas where there may be a considerable lord who wished or demanded to wield additional powers in his own right, taking a lot of the powers from the king. If you've got a strong magnate and a weak king, this happens sometimes. Or more likely an area that was on the periphery and more in danger from populations and territories adjacent. So for instance in England, they're frequently in the border areas shared with the Scots and the Welsh, where you need to make a strong magnate to defend those border regions, what are sometimes called Martyr Lords. This is, I couldn't get my hands on the original charter, I'm not sure if it's even around, but this is a printed version of the restored one from the 1660s. In Ireland, the county of Tipperary, although very well settled in the south, had never been fully subsumed or consumed into the Anglo-Norman lordship. Pressures put on the lordship by the De Bruce invasions from Scotland in the second decade of the 14th century were followed by the Black Death. And the Black Death, the De Bruces invade in 1315 as a way of opening up a second front in their war against the English for the Scottish Wars of Independence. If you remember back to your Braveheart film, Edward the Bruce is Robert's younger brother who comes over to Ireland. And then about 30 years later, In 1648 in Drogheda arrives the Black Death, and the Black Death hits the urban centres and the settled Anglo-Norman areas harder than it does the Gaelic Irish areas, because the Gaelic Irish tend to live dispersed, involved in pastoral farming, whereas the Anglo-Normans live in towns like Kilkenny, Drogheda, Dublin and Clonmel, and so it hits those areas much harder. And so what you get is essentially a reversal of fortunes, whereas the Anglo-Norman state has been growing up to this point. From about the mid-14th century onwards, it starts to shrink. So the less population you have, the less taxation being brought in, and the less taxation that's brought in means that you've got less money to spend on defence, and the less money you have on defence means that the colony shrinks as a result. The Gaelic Irish are expanding in their power, the Anglo-Normans less, and then the less territory that you have, it creates a cycle. And then you've got less money to spend on defence. Less defence means less population, means less money. So these two things, the De Bruce invasions, doesn't come down as far as Tipperary, but it does in Dublin and the North Pale area and parts of Ulster, and also the Black Death. And so the weakening of the colony may have been a reason for entrusting the relatively newly created Earl of Carrick, who later becomes the Earl of Ormond and is the first of this Butler dynasty that you'll be familiar with. The fact that it was established so soon into Edward III's minority is probably also an indication that it was to purchase favour for the unsteady Mortimer Queen Mother regency. The liberty stayed in the hands of the Earl of Ormond until 1621. The Earl of Ormond then drowned, as they skillfully weaved their way through various calamities for the major medieval earldoms that effectively saw the Butlers as the last men standing in the early modern age. Remember, both the Earls of Desmond and the Earls of Kildare are gone by this stage. Destroyed Ormond stays on, and the Burkes of Clanrickard have basically gone native at this point up until the mid-16th century, when they're later brought into the fold. Once again, weakened through the untimely death of the 10th Earl by drowning, and the new Jacobean government no longer prepared to accept their Boleyn credentials. They're related to Elizabeth I through the Boleyn family, they're distant cousins, so she's always looked favourably on the Butlers as a result. But the new Stuarts who come in post-1603 after Elizabeth is dead are no longer prepared to accept the Boleyn connections to Elizabeth as a counter to their Catholicism. And so the government in Dublin moved to deprive the family in 1621, as it says up there, of that status of a liberty, this independent state within a state in Tipperary. Now it may seem strange then that Charles II in 1660 saw fit to restore the Palatinate by letters patent, which are confirmed in 1662 by an act for the confirmation of letters patent greeted by His Majesty to His Grace James, Duke of Ormond. Now Duke of Ormond, they've really hit the big time, the Earls of Ormond, the only dukedom in Ireland at this point. They're easily the greatest family, and it's all thanks to his loyal service during the wars and the exiles in the 1650s. This restored liberty lasted only for another 55 years as the second Duke of Ormond absconded to France and went and became an exiled Jacobite at the court of the Old Pretender, and this signalled the end of the longest lasting jurisdiction of its type in Ireland, 1715. They're not gone yet in England at this point, but this is the last Irish one. So what exactly was a Palatine or a liberty? Like I say, it's about the size of a county. In this case, what becomes the county of Tipperary is really very similar to what the Palatine or the liberty would be. As V.T.H. Delaney of the King's Inns in Dublin suggests, it had a seneschal, a chancellor, a master of the rolls, a treasurer, a justiciar, attorneys, families of Irish Bretons who seem to have acted as assessors to the courts in the medieval period, martial law obviously having some recognition in the place, a sheriff, an escheator, coroners, a chief sergeant and several sergeants at arms, or in other words, it's got the full panoply of legal officers and state servants or civil servants. He also forgot to mention an Attorney General, a Chief Justice of Tipperary and a Second Justice. That's a whole legal community that the kingdom would have, that has all of its own. The King's writ as such did not run in the Palatine other than writs of error. The usual 4 offences reserved to the Crown, you can see here, were incendiary, rape, forestalling and treasure trove. Those are writs that are reserved to the Crown to pursue and to punish for themselves. Now, a lot of the time, the value, why would anybody want a Palatine jurisdiction? Well, there's the profits of justice. When those fines are taken from convicts, it means that the Earl of Ormond gets to keep that cash rather than the Crown. I've never fully understood why those 4 particular ones are kept. Treasure trove I get, because it relates to found money. If you found a pot of gold in the field, that belongs to the Crown rather than to the individual. There's very little profit from arson, rape. Forestalling relates to sometimes known as ingrating. It relates to buying. They'll be doing it now with oil. People who buy it cheap and then hold on to the reserves, say for instance grain, until the price goes up considerably and then sells it at an extortionate sort of profit. It's like the guys who build houses these days, I think. Errors could go up to the King's Bench in Dublin, and whilst equity lawsuits generally went to the Irish Parliament, such as the celebrated or indeed notorious case of Ward v Meath in the 1690s, which is a Tipperary dispute over an estate which goes all the way to the House of Lords in London and is a very important case in formulating Ireland's relationship with the Westminster Parliament and who is actually in charge of the Dublin Parliament or the Westminster one. As you can imagine, the Dublin one doesn't do very well. It did an act that confirms that Ireland was bound in a more subservient position to Westminster. Now, interestingly, many of those apprenticed in the Palatine courts went on to have careers of note at Dublin. In particular, we might acknowledge in the 17th century, Chief Justice of the Common Pleas, Sir John Keating, Sir Standish Hartstongue, the Attorney General of the Palatinate and later Third Justice of the Irish Exchequer. He was removed from the bench in James II's reign, funnily enough, for being far too hostile to Catholics. And when he was reappointed after the Battle of the Boyne by William III a few years later, he was removed from the bench for being too lenient towards Catholics. So Ireland in the 17th century are kind of damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. So John Meade, who in the 1690s was eventually offered the role of the King's Sergeant at Law up in Dublin, he was delayed in his appointment for the fact that he had a Catholic wife. And finally, probably the most talented lawyer was Sir John Everard of Feathered in South Tipperary, who sat on the Queen's bench in Elizabeth's time and was probably the best judge around at the time. He was valued and liked very highly as a judge, but his religion, his Catholicism, meant that he would be ousted from his post by Lord Deputy Chichester and a guy called Sir John Davies, a man who clearly valued religious conformity over legal ability. The latter two, Sir John Davies and Sir John Everard, competed to become Speaker of the Irish Parliament in 1613, and it's one of the times when violence actually breaks out in the chamber, when Everard, by the Catholics, is deemed to be elected, and he's carried up, as speakers in the English Parliament today are. They're still carried up and placed in the Speaker's chair. It goes back to the Middle Ages when it was a genuinely dangerous position to have to go and speak on behalf of Parliament to the King, because you might sometimes have to relate to him things that he didn't want to hear. And a very fat man, Sir John Davies, was carried by the Protestant MPs and sat in top of Sir John Everard's lap. And violence breaks out in the chamber. For most of the Restoration period, that is post-1660, when the king is restored after Cromwell's Republican regime falls, the Duke of Ormond, as Lord of the Liberty, had total control over appointments to all Palatinate posts, and through his role as Lord Lieutenant, he generally was the dominant force in all judicial appointments, whether that be in Tipperary, in that state within a state of Tipperary, or in Dublin over the four courts generally. As I've just hinted, there appears to have been a more lenient atmosphere in the Palatinate towards Catholicism. Keating, a nephew of Lord Chancellor Eustace, was alleged to be a crypto-Catholic or a secret Catholic, and Hartstongue and Meath, as I've just mentioned, had at least to some extent some Catholic leanings or plenty of Catholic relations, which would suggest that they're at least sympathetic. Now, I don't think I need to teach anybody in the room too much about Tipperary geography, but as I'm sure you'll already know, southern Midlands, but just in case there's some that might not be familiar with the medieval or the early modern part of the town, the south of the county is probably agriculturally the more prosperous sort of area with larger amounts of lowland, and it's also the more heavily urbanised in the later Middle Ages or the early modern period. So places like Clonmel, Cashel, Tipperary Town, Cahir, Feathered, Clonmel, places like that. There are obviously towns further up, and they are Anglo-Norman towns as well. But I think what probably happens in the later Middle Ages and in the early modern period is towns like Roscrea and Nina keep their Anglo-Norman heritage, but probably just within the town areas themselves, and the countryside areas around there are probably becoming more of part of the inter-Hibernicos, the Gaelic Irish area, the Irish area. The south areas still are lots of contact with Waterford and Wexford and Kilkenny and Dublin. You get this Anglo-Norman corridor down through Castledermot in Kildare into Carlow, into Kilkenny, and then it breaks out into the kind of Golden Vale area. And it's kind of worth keeping in mind that sort of legal heritage, that connection with the English state, centred in Dublin most of the time, and also connections with all the other towns around. And you can see that Anglo-Norman built heritage in a town like Feathered, where you still have those walls, are worth keeping in mind. also, though, I would say is that there's lots of connections with the Gaelic Irish area as well. What you see across a lot of Tipperary is a marcher territory. It comes from the old German word mark, meaning border, and it's a kind of a grey zone, not entirely an English area, not entirely an Irish area. There's no sort of purebred Celts in this part of Ireland. I don't think there is in any part of Ireland, to be quite honest. But what you get is this sort of marcher zone where, and it was mentioned there earlier, you would sometimes have Brehon lawyers working some of the courts within Tipperary, which is a nod to the heritage of the Gaelic Irish, and effectively meaning that the law finds a way to solve disputes, and sometimes you'll get a mix of the English common law and the Irish Brehon law, and it's kind of squished together to find solutions, and we see examples of that, particularly in Tipperary. So it's a kind of a hybrid population is what I'm trying to say. Lots of intermixing, lots of intermarriage, lots of kind of heritage and cultural. This is from the 1540s in Tipperary. It says an award in English of 2 Brehons and others concerning the Brian tree claimed by 2 Tobins. And it's basically, it's an arbitration court where the people here are acting as judges, sitting to award an estate of land in a place called the Compsey, which I think is out near Mullinahone. That's it. I was about to say the 2 brothers who used to play for Tip. That most of my Tipperary geography is based on who's from where. But if you look at the judges here, we've got a mark here for the sheriff, who's an Englishman, and Walter Filius William E. Tobiny, which is Walter the brother of William Tobin, one of the people claiming the land. And then here we've got Misha Dunica MacClanchig and Misha Murkig MacClanchig. They're both MacClancys, or in modern day probably Clancy, as in the Clancy brothers. They're a traditional Brehon family, and they're sitting on the same court as Anglo-Norman people from the English state, and they're working together on the same court, and it's not that strange for them, and it's not that different. And most interestingly for me is here Dame Eleonora Fitzjohn, female judge in Ireland in 1540. We're traditionally told women have no office holding capability within Ireland in the Middle Ages or the early modern period. That's not true. A good pal of mine, Breeze McGrath, who's written a source book on the council book for Clonmel in the same sort of period that I'm talking about tonight. She does hers on the early 1600s. She's got references there to women as acting as sentries during the 1640s war. They're on the walls with munitions, keeping lookout. They're part of that because they're widows, they've got an income, they're paying taxation, they're playing their part in municipal government of the town. A blog I wrote just the other day featured a woman in Mullingar who ran the local jail. She's the governess of the jail in the 1690s. Again, another example that you can have women in office holding capability. And these are, in some cases, very powerful people who have cash, which means they have power. Do you know, so maybe instead of always looking at it simply as a gender thing, look at it maybe as a power or a class thing. It can tell you a different sort of history for the same sort of things. Now, as mentioned above, the Butler Earls of Ormond connection through the Boleyn family meant that Black Tom Butler, as he was known, the 10th Earl, kept Tipperary out of the hands of English administrators, and so was not planted like the rest of Munster, for example, Limerick, Cork, North Kerry, Waterford, after the Munster Rebellion, because he was always loyal to the state, or generally was loyal to the state, or tried to be at least. They were cousins. She referred to him as her black husband, and she bestowed on him what one Munster poet referred to as Ord Caim Riedrich Gorchair Anam Nor Gnaw Eran Eranach. You'll excuse my Irish pronunciation. The high honour of the knighthood of the Garter, a title unusual for an Irishman. Knight of the Garter is reserved for very much favoured people. But when Elizabeth died, so too did the favour, and as I've mentioned, the Palatine lost its status in 1621, and so Tipperary was subsumed into the county system with a sheriff that reported directly to Dublin, and it was included on the circuit system for the first time. The circuit system, just as today, judges move around from town to town, dispensing justice for a period of time, moves on to the next town afterwards. With its genesis in Mid-Ulster in 1641, the 1641 Rising became a rebellion and engulfed Tipperary that winter. Most of the county, most of the time, was relatively undisputed territory, and it remained under the control of the Catholic cadet branches of the greater Butler family, particularly under the Viscount Mountgarrett. In 1649, you may have heard of him, Oliver Cromwell comes over, and in the words of the Bishop of Ferns, like a lightning passed through the land. In the aftermath of the widespread massacre in Wexford and Drogheda, 22 of the following 24 towns that Cromwell arrived before surrendered without a shot. And one of his letters from Drogheda says, "I've done this meaning his massacre, to prevent a further effusion of blood, that if you go in very hard and very violently, you scare the living daylights out of every other town you come before. And they all surrendered without violence. So I'm not saying I'm taking his side, but you know, there's maybe a point to be made. He came before Clonmel. As you can see, it's referenced in, I don't know if this beer is still on sale. Clonmel made a stand, and in the process they inflicted on Cromwell what had been up to this point a glittering career, his first proper defeat. It's little wonder that Cromwell felt that God was on his side, guiding his every move, considering he had no military training whatsoever up to the point in the civil wars, and he won all but one of the battles that he fought. And when he comes before Clonmel in 1650, they do actually put up a fight, and it's exemplary siege warfare, defensive tactics. There's a breach in one hole in the town, in the walls, and he has to come down a long street where the soldiers pour into the town, but the whole street has been sort of boarded up, all the windows and doors, and at the bottom of a long street, so it's effectively a long corridor as the English Roundheads, Cromwellians, come into the street. At the bottom of the street there's two cannons, and they're firing what's called chain shot, which is two cannonballs with a chain holding them together. And so when that comes down the street, it swings and it hurtles around, and anything that it comes into contact with, you lose limbs instantly. It's absolute carnage, and several thousand people die in this siege. It's really remarkable, Clonmel, in that regard alone. Like I say, Cromwell is not a man who's beaten otherwise. He never ever loses a battle other than at Clonmel. It's a fascinating thing. So thus what followed, I think, is a hybrid population of those who consider themselves the Old English, or the Anglo-Normans as we might call them, those descended from the people who arrived into Ireland post 1169, and the Gaelic Irish living, if not as one, that at least in very close proximity. And I'd really highlight all the time the interconnectedness of populations within Ireland, irregardless of their religion or their language or whatever else. And lots of Cromwellians arrive after 1649, and particularly soldiers garrison these towns like Clonmel, like Cashel, like Thurles, like Cahir, and they bring their population, their language, their religion. It's the first time that we get a radical republicanism, for example, in Tipperary, is when these Cromwellians arrive, because they're republicans, they're anti-monarchical. And even then you're going to get a lot of intermarriage and interconnections. A guy called Adam Molyneux, who's writing in the 1690s, makes a point that when he's trying to encourage more English people to come over to Ireland to settle, he says one of the problems with the Cromwellians, the guys who arrived over in the 1650s, is they all married local women, and they've been almost sort of contagion as such, and all their children speak Irish only. It's amazing when you think about all of the hatred in Ireland that we might have for somebody like Oliver Cromwell and his soldiers, and with good reason, I might add. He's a savage sort of a person. But the thing about language and heritage shouldn't be that surprising to us, because every time a population moves into an area, they always intermarry, they always take on local language and customs and everything else, so that shouldn't be a surprise. So what I'm saying about somewhere like Clonmel or South Tipperary or Tipperary more generally is it's a hybrid population. It's Irish, it's English, it's Anglo-Norman. People could speak both Irish and English probably most of the time, or at least they'd be coming into contact with it quite a lot of the time as well, because there's so many towns around the area, as you saw from the map. Even if you're living very much in the countryside, you're always not too far from a nearby village or an urban centre. Sometimes urban centres have some repute, as we can see from, like I say, Breathe McGrath's Clonmel, the Civic book. It's a record of the Clonmel Council books. It's a very wealthy town. It's doing really well up until 1649, that is. So to get back to the criminal law, the law in early modern Ireland, I would suggest that the law in early modern Ireland is not actually all that different to the law that we have today. I would suggest that most of the basics are probably covered. Homicides, murders, manslaughters, treasons, thefts, burglaries, assaults, highway robbery, all those sort of things are more or less covered by the law as we have it today. Obviously, it's very modern things like, computer offences or mobile phones. They didn't have them at the time, so that wouldn't be covered. But all the basics are. Occasionally in the criminal law you will get things in the early modern period. Sorry, when I say early modern, I'm talking about sort of approximately 1500 to approximately maybe 1750 or 1800, the space between the modern and the medieval. There are some things that we wouldn't have anymore in the law in Ireland, such as cultural or religious differences. For all of what I was saying about interdependency and interaction and intermarriage between various cultures in Ireland, the law does try to keep people separate. You might remember from school 1366, the Statutes of Kilkenny, which outlawed moustaches and hurling and haircuts of various sides and speaking Irish. And those laws are replenished in the 1540s again. But the very fact that you have to have laws like that should suggest to you that they're clearly not working, because we generally don't legislate for things that don't exist. So if they're legislating all the time, it's clear that it's not working. So the law is never perfectly following the English example, but it is quite heavily based on it. Most fascinating to me is a book by a guy called Bolton. Richard Bolton, he becomes Lord Chancellor of Ireland. He's not at the point when he's writing this book, but he arrives over to Ireland and he realises that there's very much written material, and particularly when you're replacing one elite population within Ireland, the Anglo-Norman. Come the Reformation time, we replace them with new English Protestants, and some of the people who we're bringing over they're kind of what you might call nouveau riche, or sort of rough diamonds. They've got lots of money, but they don't have the heritage or the class to warrant their positions within the society. So we need a book like this, the guys who are going to be becoming justice of the peace, the local sort of magistrate or the local judge. He's not necessarily very well educated in it, so he writes a book that's essentially a self-help guide to people who get the job of justice of the peace but don't have a clue of what they're supposed to be doing with it. But for historians and for students of the past, it's wonderful, because it's essentially a dummy's guide to criminal justice in the 17th century. You can get this on things like archive.org, those websites on the web. They're out of copyright, obviously, by several hundred years, so they're really interesting fun. And the contents page, but it literally covers all the usual stuff like burglary, larceny, theft, night walking, hue and cry, keeping alehouses without licenses, murders, treasons, and then all the punishments down the side. It is a fascinating read, and it gives you and it's an easy read as well. It's not heavy law, you know, it's really quite accessible, even 400 years after it was written. I think it's a fascinating read. It's well worth a look, but it gives you a very good idea of exactly what the criminal law is at the time. Now the process is probably a little bit more different. We have, at the start, in terms of detection, there's no police force in Ireland until the 19th century, as we know. Even within the Dublin area, the Dublin Metropolitan Police, I think, is the 1820s. The RIC is around the same sort of time or soon afterwards. We do have an informal way of controlling the local population, because even if it's not about religion or Irish people versus English, there's always kind of class rivalries, particularly within the urban spaces, and they tend to be the far more sort of policed areas. So within the cities and the towns, you will always have a local parish watch or constables or justices of the peace. They're non-professional. They're guys, for a year, you have to take the responsibility, because you live in Thurles, that for the year you're going to be patrolling the town at night time to make sure there's no kind of shenanigans and everybody's behaving themselves. It's as much fire watch as it is police watch, but it's largely a non-professional police force. The complaint process is largely undertaken by the victim, so there's no police bringing the case forward to the courts on your behalf. You go into the court yourself and say, that git gave me a kick when I was walking down the street last week and I want to see him prosecuted. So it leaves all that sort of hard work on the individual themselves, which might explain why some crimes are easily sort of prosecuted and others might not be. Think about the modern day, about how stressful it can be to go to court. Whether it's the same at the time, it depends on the strength of character sometimes of the complainant, or how intimidating the person accused might be. Obviously there's no DPP. Torture is officially not part of the setup in early modern Irish common law, but in prerogative justice, which does exist in Ireland, such as for the Court of Castle Chamber or the Lord Presidency Courts, which does take in Tipperary post 1621 up until the 1660s, torture can be used. Mostly it's a case of the rack, which is tying ropes at your feet and your hands and literally stretching you, and it's incredibly painful. It's almost indescribable sort of pain. Less frequent are things like strappado, which is if you take a rope and put it through a loop in the roof, and you tie my hands behind my back and you tie the rope around the wrist and then lift me off the ground. So all the pressure on your joints, particularly up here, is excruciatingly painful. It will do you permanent damage. And then obviously the boot, which I had at the very start of the talk. I don't know if you saw that properly. It was used on your former Catholic Archbishop of Cashel here in the 1580s. 2 metal boots. You fill it full of sort of oil and tar, and maybe animal grease, and then you put it over a fire, and it just slowly but surely heats up until eventually, when that boot is taken off, by the way, all of the flesh comes off his bones as well at the same time. It's, again, I don't need to say it's excruciatingly painful. And they hang him a few days later. I'm sure he would have died. He must have been in some sort of a deep shock. He's the Bishop of Cashel, Dermot O'Hurley. You might have heard of him. Funnily enough, the guys behind, well, not that funny. That's, I think, the Bishop of Down, who's executed in 1612. It's a Dutch print, or sorry, Belgian print, so it's kind of an imagined scene, because this guy is killed in the 1580s and this guy's killed in 1612. Patrick O'Lonergan behind him. I'm trying to figure out who that bishop is. I'm not quite sure. It might be the bishop of, is it Limerick in the 1640s? I'm not quite certain. But the funny thing is that the first thing they offer to all of these beforehand is they offer them a Protestant bishopric, because they want to get them into the Protestant church, because particularly if you can get a Gaelic Irish bishop into the Protestant church, he'll bring his entire flock with him, is the ideal, and they say no. And to a certain point, for those being tortured in particular, I'm not saying they're enjoying it, but they, in some cases, not necessarily go gleefully to it, but they go on the basis that it's part of their salvation of their soul. They're doing God's work, that they're suffering like Christ did in advance of his execution. And it's not to be enjoyed, but it's something to be remembered and to be really kind of thought about. When they give their speeches, now whether their speeches are accurately represented, before they die, before they're hanged, they always talk about how they're going to a better place and the joy that awaits them. I don't have it on me, but the description of this guy as he's going through the painful suffering, you get visions of him talking most joyfully and feeling as if he was lying down on a soft riverbed with all the pleasures of life, because it's part of his Calvary, so to speak. That torture does sometimes happen. I wouldn't say it's totally frequent, but it definitely does happen sometimes. And in Ireland, what the English state can get away with in Ireland wouldn't happen in England. So torture is far less frequent in England at the same time. But then remember, you're dealing with populations where there's a strong sense of othering of the Irish population. They're only Irish. They're kind of almost subhuman. So we can do this to them, because they're not like us, they're inferior, and that is used some of the time. To get back to the process just of how the law works, like I say, there is a little bit of, yes, torture is used sometimes. The process is, before you go to a trial, it goes to a grand jury, which is still used in the US and some other parts of the world. This is a preliminary hearing, and the manuscript book is really the grand jury book. We have the list of names on the front of it, and they essentially just hear all the preliminary evidence, what the DPP would do these days, and say, we think this case is worth bringing forward. We think there's enough in this to suggest that there might be a reasonable case for prosecution, and we think that case can go forward. Or, as is the case often, and what happens a lot in these cases is everybody gets away scot-free. Not everyone, but an awful lot of people, that they're not prepared to push any cases forward. And I'll try and figure out why that is by the end of the lecture. And then to the trial. The trial is lawyerless, which is interesting. In most of these cases, there's no prosecution lawyer. At the very top trials of important treason cases up in Dublin, you will get a prosecution by the Attorney General or the Solicitor General, but in the 17th century, for the run-of-the-mill sort of trials, what you'll get is just the complainant prosecuting the case for themselves as such, and the person who is defending will be defending themselves in the same sort of way. 12-man jury as we have today. Well, we have women and men today, of course, but it was mostly all men back in the day. They'll be frequently known to the accused. They'll be from the local area. In the Middle Ages, you wanted a jury who knew the facts of the case already, who knew the lay of the land, who knew the person who's accused, who knew the person who's accusing them. Total opposite today, whereas in today's court system, if you know the person, you can serve on that sort of jury. And it's seen as a virtue of the jury system at the time that it would be good if these people knew each other, because they'd already know lots about the case, and they'd actually know the truth of the matter, not only the fact, as it will be told. The juries are chosen by the sheriffs. So for important cases in Dublin, a lot of the time juries are chosen specifically to get a guilty verdict by the sheriff, particularly in political trials or treason trials. In these ones in Clonmel, I'm not so sure. I don't know for sure whether the sheriff would have been that interested one way or the other, to be quite honest. A lot of the time it's just the matter of gathering 12 people to serve on the jury in the first place. Much as the same today, nobody liked doing it. And again, this I think goes back to sometimes because most of these cases can end up in a hanging. A lot of people don't want to take on the responsibility of being responsible for somebody's death. And I think this does actually matter to people at the time. Interference by the judge with the jury does happen. Sometimes we have cases in Ireland where judges are prosecuted because they bully the jury into finding guilty when there was no genuine guilty verdict in it. One judge holds a case, Oscailga, the entire case is heard in the 1620s because a friend of his stands to gain the estate of the dead man after he's been executed, and it does happen sometimes. So the quality of the judge can be very short indeed. Some judges are quite lenient, some are very harsh. There's one called Judge Jerome Alexander. He actually owned a house out near Gertnahu, Glengool. It's what becomes the Kilcooley Abbey, that's it exactly. So a guy called Ponsonby, that's it exactly, a Speaker of the Irish Parliament in the 18th century. That's initially owned by a judge called Sir Jerome Alexander, who's known as a hanging judge. You literally can go off to Oxford to read the letters of the Duke of Ormond in the university library there, and he'll literally say, I'm sending Alexander. He's going to string everybody up. They send them up to the north coast of Ireland where it's full of Presbyterians, and he hangs them all. He hates Presbyterians as much as he hates Catholics, a very angry man. What we see a lot in Tipperary, like I said, is a lot of leniency, a lot of people with Catholic families. So you get the impression that Tipperary to a point is like living in the Shire. It's a little enclosed area, a little bit more tranquil, a little bit more peaceful than other parts of the country, you know, where we do see some very violent individuals. Trials can be short, even for ones ending in a capital sentence. They can be very, very short. In the Old Bailey in London in the 18th century, I've heard of 8-minute trials. That's 8 minutes for the entire trial, start to finish. The jury don't even leave the jury box to come back with a verdict. They just kind of have a huddle like before the second half of a match, and they decide then. They can be short. Certainly no trial lasts more than a half a day at the very, very most. So most of these trials, I suspect, are very, very short as well. Punishments that can happen in 17th century Tipperary as any other part, I think they fall into 5 major categories. First of all is shame, and we still have this in Ireland as well. We think we don't do shame anymore in relation to the criminal justice system or in relation to society as well. We always say we have to take the stigma out of pretty much everything, but I think we still very much have it. The shame punishment in the 17th century might be standing in a church or in the market cross in the centre of town, usually wearing a white linen sheet, maybe with a crucifix around your neck, or a sign saying I'm an adulterer or I'm a thief or whatever else it is, and the shame, all the rest of the people from the vicinity coming and seeing you and pointing at you and embarrassing you. It's just like having your name in the Nina Guardian or the Tipperary Star, because on the Saturday night you're taking a pee down a laneway and you're caught by the guards, and the fine is only €2, nothing, but the embarrassment to not only yourself but to your parents is 100 times worse, and they'd have paid anything to get you out of the paper as a result. Also the pillory, which is a held in position punishment. You'll see it in the movies or cartoons. It's a big plank of wood with a big hole and 2 little holes in your head, and your hands go through it. Sometimes it can be done through your feet, which is the stocks. And again, that's part of the shame, because you're sitting there in public view for 3 hours on a Saturday afternoon, and everybody is in town to look and point you, and sometimes they fling stuff at you, rotten vegetables. That's what happens in the movies. In real life, it might be sticks and stones, it might be bricks, it might be feces, it might be animal urine, or whatever else they can get. If you're a hero, like Defoe, who writes Robinson Crusoe, he's punished in the stocks in the pillory in London for offences against the sentiments of the state. He's a hero to people in the book Garlands of Flowers around his neck, and that's one of the things about the criminal justice system. It's always a fight between the individual and the state, as it is today. And so occasionally, for instance, when a bishop gets executed, if they give the right sort of last speech on the gallows, it can be a massive redemption moment for them. They're going to die anyway, like as everybody gets punished, but you can still win in that kind of propaganda battle between for instance, the forces of the Catholic Counter-Reformation and the Protestant state, and in some cases they do very well. Financial punishments, which we still have today, fines, sometimes confiscation or loss of property, and it's a good way of getting out of the the capital sentence, which I think is not a popular sentence in Ireland at the time. It's not used that much, not nearly as much as people think. But this is one of the interesting things, particularly, for instance, where for a petty larceny or a grand larceny, the difference is usually, it's just 12 pence for a male who steals. If you steal under the value of 12 pence, it's usually just a fine or some lighter punishment like a whipping. If it's over 12 pence, though, it becomes a not a misdemeanor anymore, but a felony, and that, in theory, should end in a capital conviction if you're found guilty, and that means you get hanged for it. So what happens is people will steal 10 horses, but the jury will come back and say, they're only worth 11 pence. There's not a hope in hell that 10 horses are worth 11 pence in 1660s Ireland, but the jury don't want the blood of this individual on their hand, so they're saying it's worth 11 pence, let him go and get whipped for the afternoon. And a whipping is bad, it will mutilate your back, quite badly, but at least it's not a capital conviction. And it moves us on then to incarceration, which is not always used and not always recognised as such by modern historians of the prison, but the House of Correction, it's a new sort of jail from the 1630s in Ireland when they're first being built, and Clonmel gets one. By 1643 they have theirs built, and it's a lockup it's partially used as a way to get rid of the urban poor, the kind of idle poor as they're termed at the time, put them into work in a confined space. But it's also been used, as we'll see, as a punishment, and again it's a way of incarcerating people without the ultimate sentence being used. Moving on up then to corporal punishment. Again, we've mostly done away with this. Whipping is a very popular one. You might be tied to a post in the middle of the town. And again, this is a humiliation as well. It's not just the physical pain. You'd be stripped to the waist, whether you're male or female, so that's part of the humiliation. And then the whipping itself can be quite violent. Now, in some cases, if you bribe the person doing the whipping, they may go lightly on you, but in other cases they may not. If you're notorious, they probably won't. If you've seen something like The Passion of the Christ, the movie, do you remember the Mel Gibson one from about 10 years? The scourging in that is incredibly violent, and it's that sort of thing we're talking about, with lead weights and sometimes hooks at the end of the whips, so when they hit the skin, there's a barb on it and it pulls out sometimes. It's not always a hard one, but it can be at times. The pillory, like I mentioned already. Mutilation is used a lot, particularly in the prerogative courts like the Court of Castle Chamber. What I mean by mutilation, there's a few things it can be. Boring through the tongue with a nail. That's what young people do these days. They get piercings in their tongue, but essentially it's the same sort of thing. It can mean having your nostrils slit with a scissors. So it's these areas where the skin is stretched. Having your nose slit down the bridge of your nose, again the skin will stretch off it, and it leaves a permanent remembrance to everybody that sees you, this guy's a criminal. Having your ears cut off with a large scissors, and then branding does the same sort of thing, particularly if you claim benefit of clergy, which is an old medieval device whereby people can claim to be clergy on the basis that they can read. It's where the falling out between Henry II and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Samuel Becket, Thomas Becket indeed, have a big falling out about who has control over the clergy. And it's a device to get people off the death penalty and claiming benefit of clergy. You literally read, it's usually Psalm 50 in the book of Psalms. It's called the neck verse, and what happens most of the time is people just learn it off. They get their friends to teach them it, so even if they're illiterate, it's a one-time get out of jail free card that's used. But if you claim that, you will be branded so that you can't do it a second time. So if you're a thief, it's usually a T, a letter T, it's put in a hot and it's pressed, but sometimes it might be blaspheme and it might be put there, a large B, or P for prostitution or something like that. And again, it's a permanent remembrance on the person. It's like a tattoo, you can't get rid of it. And then obviously the capital punishment, which we're fairly familiar with, which we practiced in Ireland obviously up until the 1950s in actuality. It's been we only got rid of the books in living memory. I was old enough to vote in the referendum where we got rid of it. In theory, it's the punishment for almost all felonies, but like I say, it tends not to get used much in Tipperary. The people seem quite reluctant to get rid of it. The typical hanging is, as you know, it's a gallows usually, although you can hang anybody off a tree if you have it, that's used sometimes. William St. Leger, who's the Lord President of Munster, and in Tipperary in the winter of 1641, as the rebellion from Ulster is coming down the country, he's incredibly violent around South Tipperary. In trying to quell it in Tipperary, where it hasn't yet arrived, he probably pushes the county into rebellion because he hangs so many people, and the roads around South Tipperary. Any tree tends to be littered with corpses at the time. An incredibly violent man to have running anything. That's your standard hanging though. Send somebody up a ladder, put a noose around their neck, take away the ladder. They're dispatched quite quickly, lose consciousness, probably within about 15 seconds, but a strangulation process might take about 15 minutes for the person to expire. For treason cases, and in Ireland we have a law, several laws in fact, that extend treason to a whole multiplicity of offences. So traditionally we might think of treason as being something like an offence against the state, trying to kill the king, or selling secrets to the enemy during wartime, or going over to the enemy during wartime. In Ireland it includes arson, house burning, barn burning, burning crops in the field, or regular murders. So any sort of a murder will be a high treason, and the punishment for high treason is, for female traitors, burning. In theory it means burning alive. Chances are you're probably strangling the person before you burn them, but this does happen on occasion in Ireland, and as you can imagine it's not very pretty. For the fellas, the reason you don't hang, draw and quarter women is for a sense of sort of public decency, because what happens when you hang, draw and quarter male traitors is the drawing part is just dragging them on a hurdle or a little platform along the street to the place of execution. You hang them for maybe a minute, so they're damaged but they're still alive. And then when you bring them down, you tie them onto a platform, you cut open their insides there, you cut off their private parts and burn it in the fire. You take out their innards, their entrails, and you burn them in the fire, and then you kill the person by cutting out their heart. Then you chop off their head, put it on a spike, and quarter their body into 4 parts, and usually it's put up around town gates or the road to somewhere sort of important, and that is still used in Ireland well into the 18th century. It's done away with before then, and people in this Clonmel book are punished with this punishment. We have records of it coming up. Here's a perfectly good example here. Don't know if you can read that. I can barely read it myself, and my paleography skills aren't that bad, I don't think. This is Ralph Wall, indicted for the felonious and traitorous killing and murdering of one Philip Lonergan, a tailor, by giving unto the said Philip 1 blow with a hatchet to the value of 1 shilling. You always remember the worth of the killing instrument in the Middle Ages and the early modern period is called the deodand. So the instrument that's used to kill is given over to the church. It's God's gift, the deodand. It's an old Anglo-Saxon term. They only get rid of it in the 19th century in England, when a lot of people are killed by way of manslaughter on the railways, and all of a sudden the church are saying, we want the worth of 1 steam engine, please, which are very expensive at the time, and that's the reason that it's finally gotten rid of. To the value of 1 shilling, which in both his hands he held, on the forepart of the said Lonergan his head, whereby he gave him 1 mortal wound to the depth of 3 inches of breadth and 4 inches, and of breadth of 4 inches, of which the said Lonergan languished from the 2nd of August to the 4th of the same in the 15th year of Charles II, which is 1663, on which the 4th of August the said Lonergan of the said wound died at Clonmel. That's the note in the manuscript that I've been reading, and up the top it says posse, which stands for, let me see if I can remember where all my Latin is. Posse is the abbreviation for ponitse supra patriam, which means to put oneself on the country, or to opt for a jury trial. So not pleading guilty. Your options are you can plead guilty, in which case you move to sentencing, and sometimes that's a good move to use because it means you're asking for mercy. You're coming clean and say, I did it, I'm sorry, please have mercy on me. Or you can go to the jury trial and take your chances there. Didn't work out for the said Ralph Wall, because there it says cul, which is Latin, abbreviation for the Latin culpabilis, which means culpable or guilty, and then the punishment to be hanged, drawn and quartered in Clonmel at the time. I don't know if execution was actually carried out. It might have been. It probably was, but to be honest with you, I can't be absolutely sure. The primary source for this talk are the manuscripts at the National Library of Ireland, catalogued as manuscript 4908 and 4909. Now, ostensibly these records should have gone with the rest of the Liberties documentation to Dublin in 1715 when we lose the Liberty, and they should have burnt in the forecourts. Now, I really can't be sure why these 2 books of assize records still exist. It may well have been that they became detached from the general corpus of records. Perhaps they stayed in Clonmel themselves, I don't know. They appear to have come to the National Library of Ireland from the British Library in London in the 1950s. Up to that point, their travels are unknown to me after some searching. For as much as I am in some way familiar with the English assize records, chiefly thanks to the works of J.S. Coburn and others, the process in this volume follows the English model reasonably well. As I mentioned already, Tipperary stood apart from the circuit system. All of the practitioners of the law were expected by law to spend some time studying in England by an act of the 1530s or 1540s, where all Irish lawyers have to spend time studying in England. So it's to be expected that they would follow that sort of a setup. The detail is exactly as we get it: the accused name, the details of the case, how it ended, not well for this guy, and then up the top, his option to plead guilty or to be discharged. Sometimes you're discharged without a case when the grand jury say, there's nothing in this, we don't think it's worth our while. And then obviously our guilty verdict and our up to that point, after he's been sentenced, he's got maybe about a week to get a pardon, or you might send somebody up to Dublin to beg the case, or in the case of Tipperary, directly to the Duke of Ormond. He tends to be quite against capital punishment, as it happens, the first Duke, who's around from 1610 to 1688, and so criminals in Tipperary are lucky in that regard. The grand jury, there we have it, I think is a fabulous source. The beginning of each assize is the commission in Latin to hold it, along with the list of members of the Magna Inquisicosus. The grand jury usually numbers about 15 members, but sometimes it's 17 or even 19. So these are lists of somebodies in rural Tipperary, or sorry, even in urban Tipperary, people who are of what we might call the gentry, the kind of respectable members of society, who can be relied upon to give judgment and fairness and everything else. And it's a very good list here of people who, as a sort of a social study of Tipperary society in the 17th century, can be very useful. You can't read them perfectly well there. They're a mix of names. Some of them I would identify as kind of New English or Protestant English names, but some of them are names like Keating and Butler and White, and names that you would associate with medieval Tipperary. Various places, there's Cloughjordan, there's Clonmel, there's Thurles, there's a few others. They're spread across the whole county. And as you can imagine, for a case being heard in Clonmel, Cloughjordan's right up the very top of Tip, isn't it? It's like up north of Nina, as far as I know, so it's quite a considerable distance to go for justice. This is the numbers of people that are being tried in the system. Now, considering the additional notes on pleading, verdict and sentence, it would appear that it's probably not the formal assize book, as these would normally be in Latin. I thought maybe originally it was the clerk's notebook, but one of the MS volumes, the manuscript volumes, referred to it as the Seneschal's book, suggesting that it was a formal record rather than an informal notebook of a lower functionary. Now, having said that, the Palatinate is different from other jurisdictions, so sometimes comparisons don't work. As you can see from the dates on the screen, which is from the 9th of April 63, September 63, October 65, April 66, September 67, April 69, it's not a perfect record because they should be twice a year, so we should have a spring and an autumn for each year. But as you can see for this, the criminal assize would be normally held twice a year in spring and autumn, held alongside civil hearings and accounting for the agricultural calendar after harvests and after sowing and lambing and calving. It's the same when the regular civil courts are held in Dublin, and indeed when Parliament sit. Parliament usually sits in May, is when they're usually held, because elections are held in April around the time of the assize courts, and so it doesn't interfere with the farming calendar. It's not abundantly clear why, but occasional references to previous hearings, for example, Cashel, held in Cashel, indicate that Clonmel was not the only venue for this hearing. It certainly does raise questions as to how the volume was put together, and also to what extent, if any, there was a centralised system of record keeping. On the balance of probability, I think at least some of the missing sessions were recorded in another book in Cashel, but also perhaps in Thurles or any other urban centre, perhaps even as far north as Nina or Rosscray, although they tend to be more southern from what I can see. So just how reliable a source are these records? Now, they're very good if you just want to know about assize justice in Tipperary at a specific time, September 1663, for example. But if we're using them to inform ourselves about the nature of the administration and justice in Ireland generally, we need to be a little bit more cautious than we might normally be. In the first instance, Tipperary is not a normal county in the Irish system. Every county thinks they're special or different, but I think Tipperary certainly is at this time. Being a Palatinate meant that it sits outside the circuit system, and I've said almost none of the King's writs run in that county. It comes very closely under the supervision under the Butlers of Ormond, and it would have had a specific legal culture and a form that may have been different from that of the Dublin-centred system where judges going on circuit would have come from. Now, however, we must recognise that whilst the Duke of Ormond was the Lord Lieutenant, and for as much of the Restoration period he was the power in the kingdom, was held by the same man as held power within the Liberty. Now, counties such as Kerry or Galway, for example, are very heavily Catholicised, and counties such as Down or Derry were Presbyterian dominated. Waterford, for example, had strong connections with the west coast of France. Bordeaux, Waterford and Bordeaux, people have put their sons into training apprenticeships in Bordeaux, so they come back speaking fluent French. They know all about the wine trade, the 1660s, as well as with the north coast of Spain as well. Antrim had strong Scottish links. Tipperary is a very mixed county, I find, and it's one that was probably a little more developed in terms of its urban centres than many others, particularly in the west or the northwest of Ireland, where it's very under-urbanised. But I think places like Clonmel, Feathered, Cahir, Cashel, Thurles, even Nina and Roscrea, I think Tipperary's got far more towns than it might normally have. Having said that, although the records provide us with little more than a series of snapshots and little else to compare them with, either by time or by geographical spread, if they are used in comparison with assize justice in England, for example, which I think it's reasonable sometimes to compare them with, we might, with some informed supposition and reasonable deduction, make some tentative remarks about justice as it was provided at the time. Now, of course, you don't have to take comparison into account all the time. Sometimes just doing history of crime in Restoration Tipperary is for its own sake a worthy way to time. So some general comments that we might make about some of the cases that come up. Now, whilst Justicia may be blind and do her work without fear or favour, Cleo, who is the muse of history, is always wide-eyed for trends that might help us to better understand the society and the state in which we study. We might first look, for example, at women, as they're the easiest to identify by their names. It's fairly obvious, with the exception of Hyacinth, which is a man's name in the 17th century. I made a big mistake once. It always reminds me of the comedy. Ray Gillespie, retired from Maynooth, in his contribution to a book called Women in Early Modern Ireland, made some brief mention of this source and made some very useful comments. Although it's a short piece, but it's quite sweet nonetheless. More generally, I don't think it's true to suggest that there are in excess of 1,400 indictments in the two volumes, as some of the accused are mentioned several times. For example, they are bailed or remanded in custody. They may have several records coming up, all relating to the same offence. It may also be the case that some individuals will be multiple offenders within the same assize, or may have recidivist tendencies and appear over and over again, sort of revolving door that we talk about in the criminal justice system today. Some people, for example, are held in custody but are never indicted. For our female offenders, they make up less than 5% of the overall number, so not that different from criminal justice as we understand it today. By comparison, in recent years in Ireland, we have 3.5% women making up the prison population, according to the Irish Penal Reform Trust. They feature as many types of offenders, but are most frequently found as thieves, particularly of household goods, clothes, money and jewellery. But they also feature as landladies on unlicensed pubs, for example, in the 1630s and the 1660s. We have new legislation coming in, as for today, where licenses on pubs are expensive to run because they want to control the drinking system and how the public behaves itself when it's drunk. So they want to make it expensive to open up pubs. And so you'll naturally then get these sort of shebeens in out-of-the-way places where people are not licensed and do run pubs. And a lot of women run these at the same time. And that's dangerous for early modern society, because a lot of the people who run these pubs are unmarried. So they're single women with power and with money and with a business and drunkenness. And you know what that leads to. And it's considered very dangerous at the time, as it is now. But women also commit battery and assault. And also, as we can see on the slide, they commit amongst the most serious of crimes and be punished in the most severe way. So if you can't read that quite clearly, I'll read it for you. It says, Jane, the late wife of Garrett Comerford. You find out in a second why it's the late wife. Convicted at the assize of the 6th of October in the 25th year of the reign for murdering her said husband, and judgment thereupon given against her to be drawn and burnt. Remember, women get burnt, not drawn and quartered. And having then demanded the benefit of her belly, and thereupon found by jury of matrons to be big with quick child, hath been reprieved and continued in jail ever since. Or to put it into English, to demand the benefit of her belly is saying, I'm pregnant, you can't kill me because you're killing the baby as well. And a jury of matrons is the one time that we do get women sitting on a jury in medieval or early modern Ireland. So you go out in the street, you grab 12 women, and you say, you're a jury of matrons now. You've got to examine this woman and confirm to us that she is indeed pregnant or she is not pregnant. And again, because nobody wants, especially to see a woman executed at the time, I think they will almost always say she is definitely, because I found cases where a woman demands the benefit of her belly and she is found to be pregnant, and 2 years later she still hasn't delivered the baby because she hasn't managed. So you get pregnant in jail if you're not already. But it's a very interesting case, quick child means the second trimester, so into the past 12 weeks, and she's continued in jail ever since. That sounds like it's a sometime since. And then the thing is to continue. I don't know what becomes of her, but I suspect she's probably not executed, because not only are you executing a human being, but it's also, again, a mother, which, again, we've got, we have a gendered system in our head as well as in our criminal justice system. There's no point in pretending that we don't. But also, she's already killed her husband, who's presumably the father of the child. When the child is born, if you execute the mother who brings up the child, that falls on the parish or on the community. So it's an additional cost as well as executing somebody else. It's a very interesting cases like that, I find. As Raymond Gillespie points out, they tend to steal goods of inferior worth compared with males. And again, what I was saying about the petty larceny, for when it's males, the limit is 12 pence. If you're above 12 pence, you're into a felony, which means a harsher punishment. But for women, it's 10 shillings is the amount. If you're under 10 shillings, you're in a misdemeanor, which usually means something like whipping or house of correction. But if it's over 10 shillings, and again, the female limit is, I think, set particularly high because, again, we've got a gendered criminal justice system. And you see the same in terms of remission, even in the 20th century and 21st century in Ireland. Up until recently, it was a third of the sentence for women, it was a quarter for men. Theft of livestock and agricultural product is easily the most common offences in these books. It's almost always carried out by males, though, and the worth of the horses or the cattle is obviously going to be much more than a scarf or a side of pork or silver candlesticks which are taken. Religion and extreme politics, although they don't always necessarily go hand in hand, are probably best kept as such for the purposes of this paper. As I mentioned earlier, the Restoration left behind a residue of political and religious radicals, and I mean genuine radicals. They'd be considered to be true fanatics for the period. We think maybe of Quakers today as being nice, gentle people. They're kind of anti-war and pacifists, and they work strong with charities, but they're considered proper nutters in their day in the 1660s. They're pure wild men. Think Al-Qaeda, think genuine fanatics. For the time. Like I say, very different today because they didn't pay respect to class and societal differences. Quakers never take their hats off in the presence of their social betters, and they don't believe in church ceremony the way most Protestants and Catholics would. So they're seen as has been particularly dangerous. And so here we've got 5 people. They're all fellas, all Quakers, committed. Not sure for what. I don't think they're actually committing an offence, but they are locked away as a result. Assize justice and administration was clearly used as a method of keeping check on some of these individuals that were thought to be a threat to the established order, keeping in mind that there's no habeas corpus act in Ireland at the time, so you can be held in captivity for as long as the authorities demand. You don't have that right to demand your trial. There's also plots that go on, and we see this especially in Tipperary, and again the religious radicals, particularly of South Tipperary, are prominent in these features. You wouldn't think of somebody like Oliver Cromwell as being the person who sort of brings republicanism to Ireland, because we always think of Michael Collins or Dan Breen or whoever else. But here we have it quite a bit. People with knowledge of the plot in Dublin in the 1660s. Or here we have people trying to seduce His Majesty's liege subjects with many seditious words, sedition and treasonous words, encouraging people to bring it down. And then this is a case where the House of Correction is used. And again, the House of Correction set up, as I said, in the 1630s, but it can be used informally as a prison. By a statute of 1634-1635 Parliament, every county in Ireland was obliged to build such an institution within a set period of time. There was not an overwhelming amount of convicts being sent there, but considering there are many who believe the idea of incarceration criminals as the punishment rather than just using jail as a holding pen until trial and punishment doesn't come about until the later 18th or the early 19th century, the justices of the Palatine of Tipperary would appear to buck that trend on occasion. So again, there we have, it's another female, Catherine Brown, committed by John Godfrey on the 13th of February, the 15th year of the reign, 1663, for stealing a sheet from Thomas Smith. I presume that's a bed sheet. To be sent to the House of Correction, there to remain for 3 months. Now that's a lot better than execution, mind you. Or I would argue whipping. I always ask my undergraduates, which would you prefer, 3 months in prison or an afternoon getting whipped? Because it's a reasonable question. 3 months is a long time. And prison can be an awful experience. Prison conditions aren't pleasant in the 17th century. They're not pleasant now, mind you. Because if it's a light whipping then, or what they call a moderate whipping in the records sometimes, it's a few lashes on your back. Would anybody have any strong feelings? I'm always curious. Who would prefer to go away for 3 months? It can be the humiliation of it, stripped to the waist. And that happens for females as well. And then tied to the back of a cart and you're led around the town while somebody is whipping around behind you. It can be awful. But then, like I say, 3 months away. But then if you're homeless, 3 months inside could be quite nice. Yeah, there's a collection of books called the Annual Jesuit Letters, which relate to source reports every year from Jesuits in Ireland in the 17th century, going back to headquarters in Rome. And a couple of them get locked up. They have a residence actually in Cashel, and they've got another one in Clonmel. But they're on the run, basically. They're on the runs. But some of the details from the prison experience is absolutely here. Now, some of it I think they're sexing up, because if you're on a mission, as the Jesuits in Ireland are, literally they're on the Jesuit mission, you want to send back saying, look how much we're suffering for the faith, hopefully, I'm sure we'll be going straight to heaven because look at all the miseries that we're doing for the benefit of everyone. Well, for the Jesuits that I've read for County Cavan, just last week I was reading about it, they've no light, they've no windows, so it's a what they call a cave. It's literally a little hole in the door where the food gets flung in if they decide to feed you that day. And there's 6 months worth of human excrement in a pile in the ground in the middle, And so they're really sort of, now again, how much they're bigging it up, The stat, this is an Excel spreadsheet of which I'm doing. It's huge at this point. This is just a snapshot. These would be the dates. These are the persons committing the offence. That's the gender, mostly male, just a handful of females, as you can see. That's the nature of the offence. Lots of animal theft. It's a rural country. Most people live in the countryside. So it's horses, it's sheep, it's cattle. The victim or the complainant. The verdict, that's a guilty, a guilty, a guilty, and a guilty, and that's it. Everybody else gets off. So that's unthinkable in today's court system if 90 or 95% of people were coming into the criminal justice system at the court stage and not being convicted. And just some notes, punishments, that's 3 months House of Correction, that's whipping. That's a benefit of clergy case where somebody reads the bit out of the Bible, and another 3 months in the House of Confession. In theory, everything that comes through this court system, other than the Quakers being committed for religious reasons, everybody is in theory at danger of being hanged for these offences, and nobody's getting punished. It's uncanny. I didn't believe it would be the case when I started looking into this, because we're always led to believe that the old criminal justice system is incredibly violent and incredibly persecuting of the people, and that every poor person who steals a sheep will get hanged for it. Ain't the case. I don't know why. It's perhaps the most interesting thing that the conviction rate and the sentencing is so light. In the first instance, they receive wisdom that many who work outside the immediate area of crime in the past, whether early modern or medieval, was, as I understand it, that the vast majority of crimes were capital crimes, which they are, and that the justice system was particularly harsh in this regard, which I don't think is the case. Judging by the information as provided in the records for the Palatine, it would suggest that the conviction rate is very low. A point made by Coburn for the English assizes which he studied, which would suggest they're the case, but I think they're even lower for Ireland. Corporal and capital punishments, while they do feature on occasion, are noticeable by the fact that they are far from prevalent. Now, Sir Anthony Hart, who's a High Court judge in Northern Ireland, who's passed away since, reminded me just a few years ago that in particularly the Duke of Ormond is on record as being very much against capital punishment. Very modern man in that regard. In the 20th century, lots of people, if you take a case of a policeman being shot or a notorious child rapist, people will say, hang him. They will still say it today, but 300 years ago somebody is saying, I don't think capital punishment's a good idea, I don't think it works. He always said it's far easier to reprieve somebody sentenced to death before they were hanged than afterwards, for obvious reasons. So, conclusions, and these are most tentative because it's still a work in progress. That's the excuse for every academic who's scared to say anything for sure. It's a work in progress, so don't judge me if I get it terribly wrong. The overall conviction rate is very low. Very, very, very low. What's most interesting is if you look at the Kilkenny rates for those quarter sessions, which are the sort of say is the equivalent of the district court sort of trials, is that the conviction rate is much higher. And I think the reason for that is at quarter sessions nobody gets executed. It's just imprisonment or it's corporal punishment or a fine. Whereas at the assize case, which is the equivalent of what today we'd kind of call high court jurisdictions, is that in theory almost everything can end up in a capital conviction. So the conviction rates, it's just like when in the 19th century, for instance, rape had been traditionally punished by death up until the mid-19th century, and then we get the Offences Against the Person Act, I think it's in 1856, where it's reduced to a 10-year sentence, and the conviction rate skyrockets as a result. And that's one of the dangers, and a number of judges will say this to you today when politicians and tabloid newspapers are saying, prison's a holiday camp, nobody goes to jail, revolving door, blah, 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 blah. We need to up sentences, we need to up the harshness of the system. When you do that, you lower the conviction rate. And you sometimes even make it more dangerous as a result. So for example, if, say today for example, rape we'll say is 11 years punishment, and for a murder you might do 18 years. If you bring that rape punishment up to 18 years, a number of judges have said you increase the chances of just them murdering the person afterwards. Because if you're going to get the same sentence anyway, hung for a lamb as for a sheep, It's that sort of thing. The conviction rate really does matter, I think, on the idea if the punishment is too harsh, the conviction rate drops as a result. And you can see that across many different jurisdictions around the world, is when you lower the conviction rate, or when you lower the harshness of the punishment, the conviction rate will go up as a result. Why the unwillingness to hang criminals? I think there's a few. I think pity, humanity, just the sense that this person stole a sheep, it's not worth somebody's life. The law is harsh because we got it from 300 years previous. These are laws passed maybe in the 1200s, 1300s, and I think even them they weren't hanging many people at the time. But it shouldn't reflect, that the punishment should reflect the nature of the crime. Murderers will be convicted and will be hanged. Highway robberies, because they're notorious and because they take place in dangerous, lonely places, and because it's highway robbery in the early modern period is what garroting is in the 19th century, when the tabloid newspapers do lots of stories that criminals are using piano wire to choke people. Garroting. It happens once, but the newspapers just go nuts about it. Or it's like if you remember back to the 1980s where there was a satanic cult in California and video nasties in the 1990s. Turns out it wasn't that bad at all. Or the white slave trade in the early 1900s. The newspapers get a sliver of a story and then wind it up into huge expectations. It's the same sort of thing with highway robbery. When people are starting to move around the country a lot more, they become terrified of it. I think gender comes into it a bit. I think they're going to be more reluctant, so women are less likely to hang as a result. I think fear of revenge. Remember, this is local justice for local people. It's a good idea. You can find the local judge, or certainly the local jurors, in the vicinity. And the winter nights are very long in 17th century Tipperary. And when it's very dark outside, there's no street lighting. And the three brothers of the guy who was hung the month before come around to exact revenge. And you hear, on the front door, you're going to be terrified. So remember, it's easy to find people. Everyone knows everybody at the time. It's not difficult to find people, and I think that might be part of it as well. What's interesting to me is that incarceration is starting to be used from the 17th century onwards. Like I say, traditionally prison historians will tell you it's 19th century that it's really all about. That's when we start building your Wicklow jail, your modern jail at Limerick, Galway, Clonmel is one, places like that. I think it's been used a little bit earlier than that. It's not necessarily a purpose-built prison, the House of Correction, but it is being used as such, where the punishment is not whipping, it's not a fine, and it's not a hanging, it's the incarceration. That's it, just the loss of liberty as we understand imprisonment today. Also, the process may be the punishment. So for instance, a friend of mine, and it's genuinely a friend, it's not me, one time ended up drinking far too much, went into the wrong house about a mile from his parents' house. He thought he was at his parents' house, couldn't get in the back door, tried the upstairs bathroom window, couldn't get in there, and ended up in the shed at the end of the garden with a pair of safety goggles on, where he fell asleep. And the police were called because the people in the house were terrified. And they processed him, and they said, "You're due in court next week at this time on this day." And he was terrified for that week, because he thought he'd lose his job and get into trouble, might even get a sentence of some sort. And he went down to the court, and he sat around all day. His case was never called. And he went up to the clerk, and he said, "My name's Ron," well, I won't tell you his name. The clerk read out the list and said, "You're not on the list. I have no idea who you are. You're not due in court today. You can go home." The police, I think, just put the scares on him, and that's his punishment. They knew he was a young fellow, drank too much, and got himself into a bit of trouble. But that the punishment might befit. And I think it's some of that sort of stuff. If you spend 5 months on remand in the jail waiting on your trial, that's the punishment in some cases, because the animals that you stole may have been returned. So you took them, but the property has been returned to its rightful owner. Do you really want to hang the person as a result? I'm not so sure. Things like benefit of clergy as well, that rigmarole that you can go through, just learn off. It's just one, it's called the neck verse. That Judge Alexander from down in Kilcooley Abbey, he used to not use that neck verse. Every other judge knew, and every convict, every person accused going through the system, all the friends would tell him, learn off these 2 sentences, it's in Latin. Once you can recite that, you're okay. And that will get you out of an awful lot of crimes. As time goes by, they're starting to restrict them. But they extend it to women in 1635, because traditionally, obviously, women can't be clergy, but they extend all the benefits of this benefit of clergy system to women in 1635, and that's another way out. And it's another way of not hanging people. I think there's a real reluctance within the system about hanging people. I think despite the folklore and the ballad songs that we hear today and the movies that you see about 18th century and the bloody code in England, for example, I don't think 18th century London is the same as 17th century Clonmel. I think it's certainly not the case. I think executions are actually very low, despite, and every town has a gallows hill. Even the most obscure tiny villages in the middle of northwest Westmeath have a gallows hill. Waterford have a big gallows hill project. I'm sure Thurles or Clonmel probably has one as well. Everywhere does, but I think they're not used all that much. And then what we don't see is arbitration. Those Jesuit letters that I was telling you about, they're constantly doing arbitration services, even on criminal justice matters. So this sort of arbitration service, where they will literally sit the 2 people down together and say, you did a harm to this person, what can you do to make it up to them? Let's keep, what the Jesuits are doing is keeping the Catholics out of the heretic courts. That's what they see it as, you get the magic quote marks there. That's what they're essentially trying to do, is to keep them out of the Protestant courts. And they're doing that. So what we're not seeing in these court records that I'm studying, but is probably almost certainly happening, in fact I know it's happening for a fact on that service, is things like arbitration within the community, or community solving problems for themselves, because you won't always get justice through the court systems, particularly, for example, if it's somebody wealthy or somebody who's a somebody in the local community won't always be so easily punished because they're friends with the local judges or the justice of the peace. And sometimes it's a matter that your 3 brothers go up and beat the living daylights out of them, as might sometimes happen today, and that's sometimes where the justice is brought about, and it doesn't show up in the court system so much afterwards as well, you know. And I think that's pretty much what I've got to say.
Coleman, thank you very much indeed. Okay. I think, ladies and gentlemen, on that note, we might leave it, but I think we really enjoyed it. In fact, I think, Coleman, there's a second lecture in this. So thank you very much for travelling to be with us.
Thank you. Thank you.